been a resident of Millers Point here in the National Trust Centre since 1977. We know the local area, we know the local residents, and it would be something of a tragedy to see Millers Point lost through a process that really, I don't think advantages the New South Wales taxpayer in the long term, and really leaves the area open to development pressure. Millers Point is the far northern end of Kent Street. You have Observatory Hill, the Observatory, the National Trust Centre, and then High Street overlooks what is now Barangaroo, was Darling Harbour. The original Millers Point, of course, was the point here, which was cut off in the 1950s to build the big concrete wharf. And then, of course, you've got Argyle Place, which passes through the cut under the approaches to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. But these two large sections here were purposely built in the early 1900s for the waterside workers. So you've got Windmill Street and High Street. So this is a wonderful set of buildings of their period. Our fear is that they may be sold off in one lot to a developer. Because they directly overlook the Barangaroo development, one would imagine that developers would certainly like to get their hands on them. It's an extremely historic part of Sydney, and the whole area is protected under a state heritage listing. The National Trust itself listed the area and individual properties back in the 1970s, so it's long been known the incredible importance and intactness of this area. My fears are that properties, if they're being sold outright, will be probably bought by overseas investors who don't really have an understanding of the significance of this area and who have bought the properties as an investment. So an argument is often used, particularly with state heritage listed properties, and it's now an accepted argument that they place economic hardship on the owner and that the heritage listing should be taken off. So that is a threat in itself. So about the only protection that the government is saying the area has is the state heritage listing, and we've seen too many instances where that hasn't protected these areas. And many of the long-term residents have spent a lot of money on this area. There's a lot of false information around at the moment. And they've paid rent and they've paid commercial rent. So there's a lot of unfair publicity that's gone on at the moment. We know that there are probably somewhere between 40, maybe even up to 80 properties that are presently vacant. So those properties could be leased. We believe that leasing is the way to go, long-term 99-year leasing. We believe it's more profitable for the taxpayers of New South Wales. But then you have better control. So under the first leases a number of years ago, bonds were put in place, heritage architects had to be employed, and indeed in the first leasing a number of people moved into the area who've spent a very large amount of money on those properties because they wanted to live in the area and they respected the heritage of the area. But to sell nearly 300 properties at the one time I think is inviting disaster. Millers Point is really Sydney's old town, and we know that the Rocks is a mecca for tourists, but Millers Point's extremely intact, and it's the oldest urban village in Australia. Many of the people who have lived there, they're multi-generational people, and that's part of the significance of the area. The properties in High Street particularly, and the properties in Windmill Street, were built for the waterside workers. And we understand that living throughout the area are some of those people and their descendants. The State Heritage Register actually recognises the descendants of the people as part of the social significance of the area. So that is part of the state significance of the area that was endorsed by the government. So it's difficult to understand why the government could then say we can move these people out and it won't affect the significance. That doesn't make sense at all. We want to see a continuation of individual residents, and that's why it's so important to keep the probably 40 or so long-term residents there, not to evict them or move them on to other areas as is currently happening, because we believe they need to mix in with the newcomers. And the fact that the first leases, new people came in who are now a valued part of that community shows that that was a very successful approach. And that's the way to go. You just don't do it all in one go, and you certainly don't sell it off. It's quite a small area. I mean, you can walk around this area probably in an hour or so, just quickly walk around. Many people tend not to know about it because it is very much a residential area, but there's no doubt that it will be developed in conjunction with Barangaroo, that there'll probably be coffee shops and there'll be all sorts of things, as has happened down at Walsh Bay. There's some new development that's gone in there. So, and the Trust isn't against new development as long as it's in keeping with the heritage and significance of the area. It would be very easy for that to be altered in such a way that it was no longer recognisable. To be honest, when Barangaroo was announced, we actually nominated Millers Point as being one of Australia's most endangered places, and that was several years ago, because we could see that there would be that threat. And we understand there has been some media that Lend-Lease are not wanting to place the affordable housing that they were required as part of their development consent in Barangaroo, and they're looking at alternative areas, and we are concerned that one of those areas may be Millers Point. And if they were to do that, and if that became part of the Barangaroo development, by declaring it a state significant development, the government actually switches off heritage protection, and so yes, it would leave, particularly we would think High Street, Windmill Street open for major redevelopment, which would ruin the heart of Millers Point. There's only been 4 properties sold so far. We don't know who bought them. We hope they are people who are going to live in them and treasure those places, but no, I don't think the damage has been done yet. We understand that most of the long-term residents are still there, and they're hopeful they'll be able to stay there, and we're certainly hopeful they'll be able to stay there. The Sirius building was actually constructed to house a number of the people who were moved during the redevelopment of the rocks. Now, it was originally intended in the rocks to build high-rise right through the rocks. Now, that didn't go ahead after the campaign by Jack Mundy and his Builders Labourers Federation and the Green Bands. And so the Sirius building was specifically built and designed for local residents who were displaced by some of the development that did go ahead. So it's ironic now that those people are being displaced again, and the argument being given, why should they be able to live in this area? Well, right from the start, that building was built for them and designed for them. The National Trust looked at the building, as we do look at buildings all around New South Wales, for potential listing on the National Trust Register, and it was decided by the Trust to list the Sirius building, so we believe it to be a very significant building. It's the building that you really have to go into and look at closely to realise how well designed it was. And it was purposely designed for the residents, in consultation with the residents, so that's part of the history of it. The architect who designed it, the style is very distinctive indeed. It was quite an innovative building for its time, certainly quite different to other buildings in the area, but then we tend to look at these buildings over the years through different eyes to when we first constructed. The worst possible situation would be the demolition of the building outright and the erection of a potentially larger building. Certainly a larger building there would be a windfall for whoever the developer would be. Or it simply may be converted over into apartments for wealthy people to live around the harbour. And again, you're creating this situation where the very reason the building was built is being ignored, and it's being turned over to another use, which is very, very unsympathetic to the social significance of the building and of the area generally. We've certainly met with the new Minister for Housing. We've met with the Minister for Heritage. We've been putting out policy statements. We're making it very plain. We're attending rallies, and we're hopeful that the government will listen and they'll adapt their plan. It's only a minor adaptation to go from sale to 99-year lease. If indeed the intention, and the main intention, is to protect the heritage significance of this area, then we believe that's the only way to go. So we're hopeful government will reconsider. Millers Point is a living community, and the real threat to Millers Point is that it will be redeveloped and have a totally different character and be no longer recognisable as the old town centre or the old town of Sydney. That's the real threat.